We are on page 53 in your journal. So we're talking about decimals, fractions, and percents. So decimals, fractions, and percents, all three of them are part of a whole. So a decimal is part of a whole, a fraction is part of a whole, and a percent is part of a whole. All right, when you're talking about less than one whole. So when we have something like this, this is less than one whole. So we're going to convert this decimal to a fraction. And so when we have this back in fourth grade, we learned to put our 1 under our decimal, and with every place value that's written, we put a 0, and that helps us read this decimal. So 42 hundredths was how we'd read this decimal. So this is part of a whole. This is not even one whole dollar if we were thinking of it like money. So we're going to read the decimal correctly, 42 hundredths, and we're going to write it as a fraction. So 42 hundredths. And then we're going to simplify if needed. In sixth grade, they're just going to expect you to simplify every single time. They might not even put it in the directions. So if you have a fraction, and they're going to expect you to simplify it. So we're going to find a factor. So we could look on our blue sheet and realize, well, this ends in a 2 and this ends in a 0. So we could divide both of these by a factor of 2. So 42 divided by 2 is 21, and 100 divided by 2 is 50. So this is our simplified fraction that's still equivalent to 42 hundredths, but this is our simplified fraction. So 21 fiftieths is equivalent to 42 hundredths. So we write this decimal as a fraction. And so in real life, there's lots of different ways that we use these things. Percentages we use a lot with our grades. When we talk about borrowing money from a bank, our percentage interest rates, those are in percentages. We also talk a lot about, like even in the daily forecast, there's a 20% chance of rain. And so we talk a lot about percentages and use percentages in our real lives when you grow up. Fractions, I'm sure there are a lot more, but the one thing we talk about a lot is cooking or using them as ratios to convert them to percents. And decimals, I think mainly we use it with money. Dollars and cents, we use decimals a whole lot. So depending on what your job is when you grow up is how you are going to use this math. So converting from one to the other, it might just depend on what situation that you're in and what type of data that you need. So I know this fraction doesn't look like anything like this. It doesn't have a 4 in it. I think a lot of students think that our fraction has to look exactly like our decimal, and it doesn't all the time because sometimes you can simplify it. So this fraction is equivalent to this decimal. All right, so we're going to go from decimal to percent now. So remember, a decimal is part of a whole and a percent is part of a whole. It's just two different ways to write an equivalent number. So we're going to convert, just means change, okay? Convert is just a fancy word for change. The decimal to a percent. So we have 42 hundredths, and we're going to change it to a percent. So what you need to know about a percent, okay, and you can even see the 1 and the 0 and the 0 that make up the 100. So what percent means is that is a part out of 100. So you're going to hear me say out of 100 a lot when we're dealing with percentages. So if we write this and read it correctly, like we learned to in fourth grade, 42 hundredths, and this is going to say 42 out of 100. So this decimal tells me that that's 42 hundredths. This percent sign is going to say that I have 42 out of 100. So I don't need the decimal here because I already have the symbol that tells me that it's part out of 100. Okay, so this decimal is telling us it's a part of a whole. Now this sign is telling us it's part of a whole. So we want to know, if we think of this as money, it would be 42 cents or it would be 42 hundredths. So in order to convert this decimal to a percent, we're going to multiply it by 100 because it does need to be 100 times bigger because this sign is saying out of 100 already. We don't need a decimal to tell us that. So we are going to multiply by 100. Now the shortcut, which we practiced last week, was we move the decimal places 2 places to the right. So multiplying is moving it to the right. There's 2 zeros here in 100, so we're moving it 2 decimal places. So we write our 42 hundredths and we move it 2 places to the right, and we just multiplied that by 100. We did the shortcut. So now we have 42. So it's not 42 whole, right? It's not 42 wholes. It's 42 out of 100. It's still a part of a whole, just like this decimal is part of a whole. So here's your hint. I always talk about it with money. 42 cents is 42 cents. Okay, and how many cents in a dollar? There's 100. So there's 42 out of 100 cents. So that's 42%. All right, so this is not on your notes but to go from a percent to a decimal, okay, so let's take that 42%. And so if I'm going to make it a decimal, okay, if I'm going to make it a decimal, that means I'm going to put a decimal point in it, and I'm not going to write this percent sound. So I don't have this percent sign telling me it's out of 100 anymore. So I'm going to take my 42, okay, and I'm saying, okay, there is my invisible decimal. I always say that's there, right, but that we don't write. And instead of multiplying by 100, okay, instead of multiplying by 100 to get it to be a percent, we're going to divide by 100 to get it back to a decimal. So we're going to move it 2 places to the left. So now 42% is equal to 42 hundredths. So this is 42 out of 100. This is 42 out of 100. So now let's go from percent to fraction. So percent to fraction is very similar to your decimal to fraction. You read it the correct way, and then you write it as a fraction, all right? So the 42%, the percent sign means out of 100. So 42% means 42 out of 100. So we're going to write 42 out of 100 as a fraction. And so this is where it's very similar to making it from a decimal to a fraction. We always still want to simplify a fraction. So we divide by 2, we divide by 2, and we get 21/50. So 42%, see, it's not even half, right? Half of 100 is 50. So this is not even half of 100. So 21 is not even half of 50, because half of 50 is 25. You don't even have 25. You don't have half. You have just under a half. So this is a reasonable fraction to be equivalent to 42%. Okay, we're going to go to page 59 now, and we're going to be writing a fraction as a percent. So when you write a fraction as a percent, there's a lot of different ways to do it, okay? I'll show you a couple different ways in the future, but right now I'm going to write a percent box, okay? Your 7th and 8th grade teacher both use these for percent, so that's why I teach you this now. And when we get into more complicated percent problems, you'll really like this percent box. So this percent box is basically a proportion, okay? It's a proportion. So you have a ratio, an equal sign, and a ratio. So you have part to whole and part to whole. So with percent, remember percent always means out of 100. So we're going to find what percent out of 100 is going to be equal to this fraction. So we're going to write our fraction here. If it was 1/5, we'd put 1/5. It was 2/10, we'd put 2/10. And then we're going to solve it like a proportion. All right, so let's do an example. Write 9/20 as a percent. So we're going to put 9/20 in our percent box. And remember, this is just a proportion. So we're going to put 9/20 in our percent box. The percentage means out of 100, so that 100 will always go there when we're talking about percentages, okay? So this is what we're trying to find. What percent out of 100 is equal to 9 out of 20? So let's think logically. 20, half of 20 is 10. We don't even have that. So we have something that's a little bit less than 1/2. So this should be a little bit less than 50%. Okay, 50%, 50 is half of 100. And this is not quite half of this, so we know that this is going to be less than 50%. So we can either cross multiply or divide. Okay, we could cross multiply 900 divided by 20. That would work every time. Or sometimes we can look for an easy way with friendly numbers. We've been doing this for a few weeks. So I could look and say, okay, I'm going toward what I want to find. So I'm going to go in the same direction here. and I'm going to try to find a relationship and see if they're friendly numbers. Can I say 20 times something to get 100? Yes, I can say times 5. So times 5. So that would be 45. 9 times 5 is 45, so that would be 45%.